Close your eyes and picture the endless Atlantic Ocean, its waves carrying not just ships but millions of stolen lives. From the bustling ports of West Africa to the crowded decks of wooden slave ships and the plantations of the Americas, this story is one of human suffering, resilience, and a world forever changed. Tonight, in Calm Whispers, we unfold the long, harrowing tale of the transatlantic slave trade, its beginnings, its brutal realities and the deep scars it left on history. It is not a tale told to frighten you, but to remind us of the strength of those who endured it. Let the quiet unraveling of this dark chapter guide you into rest, as history flows like a tide beneath your dreams. Before we continue, dear friends, remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you'll never miss our sleepy journeys through history. And before we start, I'd love to know, from where are you listening and what time is it for you right now? It's amazing to see how far these stories travel. You find yourself standing on the rocky shore of a small island off the west coast of Africa in the year 1482. The Atlantic stretches endlessly before you, its waters shimmering under the intense tropical sun. Behind you, a makeshift settlement of wooden structures and canvas tents clings to the volcanic soil of what the Portuguese call São Tomé. The air carries the scent of salt and unfamiliar spices, mingling with the sound of voices speaking in languages you've never heard before. The men who brought you here arrived in strange wooden vessels with billowing white sails, their skin pale as parchment and their hair the color of straw. They wear heavy woolen garments despite the oppressive heat, and they speak rapidly in a tongue that sounds like no human language you've ever encountered. These Portuguese navigators have been exploring these coasts for decades, establishing trading posts and plantations on islands like São Tomé and Príncipe, seeking the source of the gold dust that flows down the rivers from the African interior. The settlement you observe represents something new in human history, a systematic attempt to create agricultural enterprises using forced African labor for European profit. The Portuguese have tried using the indigenous populations they encountered in their Atlantic island colonies, the Canary Islands, Madeira, the Azores, but the native peoples either died from European diseases or proved too few in number to meet the growing demand for labor. Sugar cultivation, introduced from the Mediterranean, requires constant attention throughout its 18-month growing cycle. Fields must be cleared, cane planted, weeded, harvested, then processed immediately in mills before the precious juice spoils. The work is backbreaking, repetitive, and utterly incompatible with the seasonal rhythms of traditional European agriculture. The solution the Portuguese have developed seems, to them at least, ingenious. Rather than attempt to transport European peasants who might flee or demand traditional rights, they have begun purchasing captives from African traders who arrive at the coast with strings of human beings bound together by rough rope. These African traders come from various kingdoms and chiefdoms, sometimes from hundreds of miles inland, bringing captives taken in wars, raids, or as punishment for crimes real or imagined. The Portuguese provide textiles from India, brass goods from Northern Europe, wine from their own vineyards, and increasingly firearms that give their African trading partners significant advantages in local conflicts. The plantation system taking shape on São Tomé operates with mechanical efficiency that would seem familiar to any modern industrialist. Workers are roused before dawn to begin their daily tasks, fed minimal rations of maize porridge and palm wine, then worked until darkness forces them to stop. Their housing consists of windowless huts constructed from available materials, palm fronds, mud, scraps of salvaged wood. They possess no personal belongings beyond the rough fabric that covers their bodies, and they enjoy no legal protection should they fall ill, attempt escape, or simply fail to meet production quotas. Death rates are appalling. Some estimates suggest that half the workforce perishes each year from disease, overwork, or violence. Yet the system continues because sugar prices in European markets remain high enough to justify the constant replacement of human capital. For the captives themselves, existence has become a sequence of incomprehensible horrors. Imagine being seized in some distant village, perhaps during a night raid or as the culmination of long-standing tribal conflicts. You might be marched for weeks to reach the coast, your feet torn by rocks and thorns, your body weakened by insufficient food and water. At each stop along the journey, you're examined like livestock, your teeth checked, your muscles prodded, your worth determined by factors utterly beyond your control, your age, your apparent health, your ability to perform hard labor. The language spoken around you changes constantly as you move from trader to trader, each man speaking of you as if you were cargo rather than a person with memories, family, hopes and dreams. When you finally reach the coast, perhaps at a place like Elmina Castle on what will later be called the Gold Coast, you encounter the ocean for the first time, a body of water so vast it seems impossible that it could have shores on its opposite side. The Portuguese ships anchored in the harbour seem like floating cities, their rigging complex as spiderwebs, their crews speaking in rapid, incomprehensible syllables. You cannot know that these vessels represent the cutting edge of European maritime technology, designed to carry maximum cargo across maximum distances with minimum crew. You cannot understand that you are about to become part of an economic system that will enrich European merchants while devastating your homeland for centuries to come. The daily routine aboard these early slave ships follows patterns laid down by centuries of Mediterranean maritime tradition, but adapted to accommodate their unique human cargo. Morning begins with the crew checking the anchor cables and sails, then turning their attention to the captives confined below deck. The ship's surgeon, if one is aboard, makes his rounds accompanied by armed sailors, examining the captives for signs of illness that might spread through the tightly packed population. Those deemed too ill to recover are sometimes thrown overboard, a brutal calculation made necessary by the economic reality that a dying captive represents a loss of potential profit, while an infected ship threatens the entire voyage. The food provided consists primarily of ship's biscuit, salted meat or fish, and small quantities of water. The African captives, accustomed to very different diets, often refuse this food initially, leading to force feeding through leather funnels or punishment for non-compliance. The psychological impact of these experiences cannot be overestimated. Men who had lived their entire lives within a day's walk of their birthplace found themselves confined in wooden chambers that pitched and rolled with the ocean's movement, surrounded by people who spoke languages they could not understand. Knowing that the world they had known was gone forever, women faced the additional terror of sexual violence from the crew, who viewed them as property to be used rather than human beings entitled to basic dignity. Children, sometimes separated from their parents during the initial capture and transport, suffered both the trauma of dislocation and the particular vulnerability that comes with being small and weak in an environment where might makes right. As the Portuguese vessels completed their loading of human cargo and prepared for the return journey to Lisbon or other European ports, they participated in what would become known in later centuries as the triangular trade system. Ships departed European ports carrying manufactured goods, textiles, metal goods, firearms, alcohol that could be traded for African captives. After loading their human cargo, they crossed the Atlantic to deliver their captives to plantations in the Americas or to European markets where they might be sold for domestic service. The vessels then returned to Europe carrying agricultural products, sugar, tobacco, cotton, that had been produced using the labor of previous shipments of African captives. Each leg of this triangular journey was profitable, creating a self-reinforcing economic system that would endure for more than 3 centuries. The individuals who participated in these early voyages, the Portuguese captains who commanded the ships, the sailors who crewed them, the African traders who provided the captives, and the European merchants who financed the expeditions, often saw themselves as simply engaging in commerce, no different from the spice traders of Venice or the cloth merchants of Flanders. They could not have imagined that their activities were creating precedents for what would become one of the most extensive and brutal systems of human exploitation in history. The moral implications of their trade troubled some, but such concerns were easily dismissed as the unavoidable costs of economic progress. The wealth generated by sugar cultivation and the slave trade that supported it helped transform Europe from a collection of relatively poor, agriculturally based societies into the center of a global commercial empire whose influence would reshape every continent. By the early 1500s, the Portuguese had refined their system sufficiently to begin expanding operations. They established additional island colonies, developed more efficient shipping routes, and cultivated trading relationships with African kingdoms that would supply captives for generations. The Spanish, having recently established their own American colonies following Columbus's voyages, began looking to Portuguese suppliers for labor to replace indigenous populations devastated by European diseases and harsh working conditions. The French, English, and Dutch would soon enter this lucrative trade, each bringing their own innovations in ship design, plantation management, and trading practices. The ordinary people whose lives were disrupted by these developments, African farmers whose villages were raided, European sailors who died from tropical diseases in unprecedented numbers, indigenous populations whose homelands were transformed into plantation economies, could not have understood that they were experiencing the birth of a new kind of global economy. The transatlantic slave trade in these early years appeared simply as another form of commerce, distinguished primarily by its commodity. Yet the human consequences of these trading relationships would prove impossible to contain within the tidy categories of economic exchange. The violence, fear, and systematic degradation required to produce the labor force necessary for plantation agriculture would generate social and cultural changes that would reverberate across 4 continents for centuries to come. As you prepare to close your eyes for sleep, consider the weight of these historical transformations. Try to imagine yourself as one of those early captives standing on the deck of a ship that will carry you away from everything you've ever known toward a future you cannot comprehend. Feel the uncertainty, the terror, the profound dislocation that comes from having your world torn away and replaced by something utterly alien. Then consider how economic forces, money, markets, profit motives could create a system that treated human beings as commodities, and how that system would shape the course of history for generations yet unborn. What thoughts might have occupied the mind of that captive as the ship weighed anchor and the African coast disappeared below the horizon? What could they have understood about the journey ahead, or about the forces that had conspired to place them in bondage? And how might their experience of crossing the Atlantic Ocean compare to the psychological journeys we each undertake when we leave behind familiar worlds and venture into the unknown territories of our own lives? These questions remain with us as we prepare to continue our exploration of this history in the next section, where we will examine how the transatlantic slave trade evolved from these early Portuguese experiments into a massive multinational enterprise that would shape the modern world. Imagine waking up in the year 1650 aboard a Dutch merchant vessel anchored off the coast of what will eventually become Ghana. The ship rocks gently in the morning swells, its wooden timbers creaking with each movement. Above deck, the crew performs their daily rituals, checking ropes, adjusting sails, preparing food for both themselves and the human cargo confined below. This vessel represents the cutting edge of 17th century maritime technology, its design refined over decades of experience to maximize both speed and cargo capacity. But the cargo it carries is unlike anything that previous generations of merchants have transported. The Dutch have entered the transatlantic slave trade relatively recently, but they bring with them sophisticated business practices developed through their dominance of European commerce. The ship you're aboard carries detailed accounts books, carefully maintained ledgers that track every expense and every potential source of profit. The captain records not only the number of captives purchased and their purchase prices, but also their estimated ages, apparent health conditions, and any special skills that might affect their market value. He notes the cost of food for both crew and captives, the price of fresh water obtained at various ports, the wages paid to sailors, and the constant expenses of maintaining a wooden vessel in seaworthy condition during a journey that might last 6 months or more. The business model these Dutch merchants have perfected operates on principles that would seem familiar to modern corporate executives. They have calculated the optimal number of captives to carry based on ship size, expected mortality rates during the voyage, and anticipated prices in American markets. They have determined the minimum amount of food and water necessary to keep their human cargo alive while maximizing profits. They have developed systems for minimizing losses from disease, rebellion, and suicide, all common occurrences that threaten the profitability of each voyage. The entire operation runs on careful calculations of risk versus reward, with human beings reduced to entries in account books. Below deck, the daily routine begins as dawn approaches. The captives, men, women, and children, from dozens of different African ethnic groups who may share no common language, awaken to find themselves still confined in the wooden prison that has been their home for weeks or months. The space below deck measures perhaps 60 feet in length and 20 in width, but it currently contains between 200 and 300 human beings. Each person has less than 6 square feet of space, barely enough to lie down, impossible to stretch out fully, certainly insufficient to move about freely. The wooden planks beneath them are slick with waste, perspiration, and blood. The air is so foul that sailors risk suffocation if they remain below for more than a few minutes at a time. The ship's surgeon conducts his morning inspection, moving through the mass of humanity with practiced efficiency. He looks for signs of infectious disease that might require quarantine or, more commonly, disposal overboard. He checks the condition of those who appear to be failing, making the cold calculation of whether they might survive long enough to be sold or whether they represent an immediate loss. His medical knowledge, such as it is in this era, before modern understanding of infection and disease transmission, provides little practical help. Most treatments consist of bleeding, purging, or the application of various herbal preparations whose effectiveness remains uncertain. The primary purpose of his presence is not healing but assessment, determining which captives represent salvageable investments and which must be written off as losses. The food provided to the captives follows established patterns designed to minimize costs while maintaining basic life functions. The morning meal typically consists of a thin porridge made from maize or millet, perhaps sweetened with a small amount of molasses if any is available. The midday offering might include a small portion of salted meat or fish, usually of poor quality, often partly spoiled, but representing precious protein in a diet otherwise composed almost entirely of starches. Evening brings another serving of porridge, perhaps supplemented with a small quantity of palm wine or rum. The quantities provided are calculated to sustain life while avoiding the expense of proper nourishment. Captives who refuse this food, either from grief, illness, or cultural unfamiliarity, are force-fed through leather funnels or punished for their refusal to comply with the ship's routine. The psychological impact of these conditions becomes apparent through the behaviors that develop among the captives. Some withdraw completely, refusing to speak or respond to those around them, their minds seemingly retreating to some inner sanctuary where the reality of their situation cannot penetrate. Others become violent, lashing out at their fellow prisoners, or attempting to attack their captors despite the certainty of brutal retaliation. Women face particular vulnerabilities as the crew often views them as available for sexual exploitation. Children, especially those separated from their families during the capture and initial transport phases, frequently die from what appears to be simple despair, their small bodies unable to sustain the combination of physical privation and psychological trauma. The sailors who crew these vessels face their own forms of degradation and danger. They come from the poorest classes of European society: dock workers, failed farmers, men fleeing debts or criminal charges, those simply desperate enough to accept employment in an industry known for its brutal conditions and high mortality rates. Many cannot read or write, having signed on to voyages they barely understand through marks made on documents they cannot comprehend. They work under the absolute authority of captains who possess near monarchical power aboard their vessels, subject to flogging, imprisonment, or abandonment in foreign ports for perceived infractions. The mortality rate among crew members often exceeds that of the captives themselves, as European immune systems prove inadequate to African diseases like malaria and yellow fever. Yet despite these hardships, the business of slave trading generates enormous profits for those who finance and organize the voyages. A successful voyage might return 200% or 300% profit on the original investment, even after accounting for all the anticipated losses. These profits flow primarily to merchants and investors who remain safely in European ports, never experiencing the harsh realities of the trade they finance. They read the account books, calculate their returns, and plan their next ventures with little consideration for the human suffering that generates their wealth. The entire system operates with the clinical efficiency of any large-scale commercial enterprise, with human misery reduced to columns of numbers in business ledgers. The daily routine aboard these slave ships reflects this purely economic perspective. Every aspect of the operation is designed to maximize profit while minimizing risk and expense. The captives are treated not as human beings but as commodities that must be delivered to market in saleable condition. Their health is monitored only insofar as it affects their market value. Their psychological well-being is completely irrelevant to the ship's operations. Even their deaths are handled with an eye toward minimizing inconvenience. Bodies are disposed of quickly, with little ceremony, and the financial loss recorded in the official account books. As these ships completed their loading operations along the African coast and prepared for the Atlantic crossing, they carried with them not only their human cargo, but also the accumulated weight of centuries of commercial development. The transatlantic slave trade had evolved from the relatively simple operations of the Portuguese in the 15th century into a sophisticated, multinational business enterprise that would eventually transport more than 12 million people across the ocean. The systems developed in these 17th century voyages, accounting methods, shipping practices, methods of controlling captives, techniques for maximizing profit while minimizing loss, would become standard procedures throughout the industry. The ordinary people whose lives were intertwined with these developments, the captives chained in the holds, the sailors managing the vessels, the merchants financing the voyages, participated in historical forces they could barely comprehend. They understood their immediate circumstances. The captives knew they were prisoners being transported to an unknown fate. The sailors knew they were employed in a dangerous but lucrative trade. The merchants knew they were generating unprecedented profits. But none of them could have grasped how their individual experiences would coalesce into a historical phenomenon that would reshape global economics, demographics, and cultural patterns for centuries to come. As you drift towards sleep, try to imagine the sensory experience of those confined below deck, the overwhelming stench, the crushing press of bodies, the constant sound of suffering, the complete absence of privacy or personal dignity. Consider how human beings adapted to such conditions and what psychological adjustments allowed them to survive experiences specifically designed to break their spirit. Then reflect on how the systematic commodification of human life, when practiced on such a massive scale, might alter the moral fabric of societies that benefit from such practices. These questions prepare us for our next section, where we will examine how this business of human cargo reached its peak of efficiency and brutality in the 18th century, and how the system began to generate its own opposition among those who found its practices morally indefensible. Picture yourself aboard a British slave ship in the year 1750, at the height of what historians will later call the mature phase of the transatlantic slave trade. This vessel, currently positioned somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, represents the culmination of more than 2 centuries of incremental improvements designed to maximize the efficiency of human transportation across oceanic distances. The ship itself is a masterpiece of maritime engineering, a floating fortress constructed specifically for its grim purpose, its hull divided into compartments optimized for cargo capacity, its deck reinforced to support the weight of cannons that might be needed to repel attackers or suppress rebellion among the captives. The routine aboard this ship operates with the mechanical precision of a well-orchestrated performance. Dawn breaks to reveal a deck already bustling with activity. The crew, having survived another night of potential mutiny, disease, or storm, begins their morning tasks with practiced efficiency. Below deck, the captives awaken to find that some among their number have died during the night, victims of disease, despair, or simply cumulative effects of prolonged confinement in conditions specifically designed to minimize the space, food, and medical care devoted to each person being transported. The bodies are removed quickly, thrown overboard with little ceremony. Beyond the briefest recording in the ship's official logbook, the vessel currently carries 400 human beings distributed among its various cargo holds. According to a system refined through decades of experience, men occupy the largest compartment, chained together in pairs to prevent both escape and the possibility of coordinated rebellion. Their space measures approximately 4 feet in height, insufficient for standing, barely adequate for lying down. The air in this compartment has become so foul that sailors avoid entering except when absolutely necessary, instead using long poles to pass food and water to the captives or to remove bodies. Women and children occupy separate compartments, ostensibly for their protection, though this arrangement often facilitates rather than prevents sexual violence from the crew. The entire arrangement represents an engineering solution to the problem of transporting the maximum number of human beings while maintaining sufficient control to prevent successful uprising. The daily routine continues with the distribution of food, always calculated to provide the minimum nutrition necessary to sustain life while minimizing costs. The menu consists primarily of ship's biscuit, hardtack so hard it must be soaked in water before it can be consumed, and small portions of salted meat or fish, typically of the lowest quality available. Fresh water is rationed carefully, with each person receiving barely enough to prevent dehydration in the tropical heat. The crew receives somewhat better provisions, but even they suffer from the poor food, contaminated water, and disease-ridden conditions that characterize these voyages. Scurvy, dysentery, and various fevers claim lives among both captives and crew with grim regularity. The psychological atmosphere aboard such vessels becomes increasingly volatile as the voyage progresses. During the early days, captives often remain hopeful that their situation might improve or that they might somehow escape and return to their homes. But as weeks turn into months, as the African coast disappears behind them and the American shore remains distant, despair becomes the dominant emotion. Some captives withdraw completely, refusing food and water until death provides release. Others become violent, attacking their fellow prisoners despite the certainty of brutal punishment, sometimes provoking their own deaths through what amounts to suicide by guard. Children, especially those separated from their families, frequently die from grief and neglect, their small bodies unable to sustain the combination of physical deprivation and psychological trauma. The crew members who witness these developments often display a disturbing capacity for emotional detachment. They have been conditioned to view the captives as cargo rather than human beings, and they speak of handling or managing them using the same terminology they might apply to livestock or other commodities. Many crew members participate in systematic abuse, sexual violence, physical punishment for minor infractions, the withholding of food or water as punishment, the destruction of personal items that might provide comfort to the captives. These behaviors are not merely individual acts of cruelty, but integral components of a system designed to maintain absolute control over a population that vastly outnumbers the crew. By breaking the captive's spirit through systematic degradation, the crew ensures that the ship reaches its destination with its valuable cargo intact and manageable. Yet even within this brutally efficient system, moments of human connection occasionally occur. Sometimes crew members develop sympathy for individual captives, providing extra food or medical attention, teaching basic navigation skills, or facilitating communication among prisoners who share common languages. These individual acts of kindness, while rare, demonstrate that the system of slavery required constant reinforcement to maintain itself. Without ongoing violence, without daily reinforcement of the captive's subordinate status, without continuous efforts to prevent the development of human relationships between captives and crew, the entire structure might have collapsed. Under the weight of its own inhumanity, the arrival of such vessels at American ports, the final destination of the Middle Passage, marks not liberation, but merely the transition from one form of bondage to another. The captives are unloaded, cleaned, examined, and prepared for sale using methods specifically designed to maximize their market value. They are fed better food for a few days to restore some appearance of health. Their wounds are treated superficially to hide the most obvious signs of abuse, and they are taught basic commands in whatever language their new masters will use. The auction process itself becomes another form of psychological torture, as families and friends are separated permanently, as individuals are examined like livestock, as the terrible uncertainty about their future fate becomes absolute. The long-term effects of this system extend far beyond the immediate suffering of those who endured the Middle Passage. The survivors carry with them not only physical scars but also psychological wounds that will affect their descendants for generations. They have experienced systematic attempts to strip them of their African identities, their languages, religions, family structures, cultural practices, even their names are replaced with European alternatives. They have learned that human beings can be treated as property, that their lives possess value only insofar as they can perform labor for others, that resistance brings punishment while submission brings only temporary survival. These lessons, learned under the most extreme circumstances imaginable, become part of the cultural legacy they transmit to their children and grandchildren. The development of this mature slave trade system also generates profound changes in European societies. The enormous profits flowing into ports like Liverpool, Bristol, Nantes, and Amsterdam provide capital for new industrial ventures, helping to finance the factories, mines, and transportation networks that will drive the Industrial Revolution. The wealth accumulated through slave trading enables merchants to establish banks, import luxury goods, build magnificent homes, and fund the cultural and intellectual developments that characterize 18th century European civilization. Yet this prosperity rests on foundations of human misery so extreme that its moral implications cannot be ignored indefinitely. As you prepare to conclude this exploration of the transatlantic slave trade's peak period, consider the profound paradox embedded in these historical developments. The same century that produced the Enlightenment's brilliant philosophical developments, new concepts of human rights, natural law, individual dignity, and social progress, also witnessed the systematic reduction of millions of human beings to the status of commodities. The ships that carried enslaved Africans across the Atlantic also transported the ideas, technologies, and cultural patterns that would eventually generate the abolitionist movement that would destroy the slave trade. The very brutality of the mature slave system contained within it the seeds of its own destruction, as moral outrage at its practices slowly built among those exposed to its reality. How might we understand this historical irony? What does it reveal about the relationship between economic interests and moral principles? How could societies that celebrated liberty and human dignity simultaneously participate in or benefit from systems of extreme oppression? And what parallels might we find in our own time, where sophisticated economic systems sometimes generate human costs that remain hidden from those who profit from them? These questions linger as we prepare to examine how the transatlantic slave trade finally came to an end, and how the societies that had participated in it struggled to reckon with the moral and social consequences of their involvement. But before we continue to that story, imagine yourself once more aboard that ship in 1750. Feel the endless rocking motion that has become your constant companion. Smell the mixture of salt air and human waste that defines your environment. Hear the constant background of suffering that forms the soundtrack of your existence. Try to comprehend how human beings endured such conditions and what reservoirs of resilience they must have drawn upon to maintain any sense of themselves as human beings deserving of dignity and freedom. This contemplation prepares us for our next story, where we will examine how the very system designed to treat people as commodities ultimately generated the moral forces that would destroy it. Imagine yourself as you awaken in a dim wooden chamber that rocks gently with the rhythm of ocean waves. The air you breathe is thick with the smell of human bodies packed too closely together, mixed with the stench of waste, vomit, and the particular sourness that comes from fear, perspiration. You cannot remember how many days or weeks you have been confined in this space, only that the routine has become as predictable as it is unbearable. Your wrists remain chained to the person lying beside you, a stranger who speaks a language you cannot understand, yet with whom you share the most intimate aspects of existence in this floating prison. The story of how you came to be here begins not with your capture, but with your birth in a village located several hundred miles inland from the African coast. Your early life followed patterns established by countless generations before you, helping tend the family plots of millet and sorghum, learning the songs and stories that preserved your people's history, participating in the seasonal festivals that marked the agricultural cycle. You married young, as was customary, and had begun building the mud brick house that would shelter your growing family. The possibility that you might one day be seized by strangers and transported across an ocean you did not know existed never entered your thoughts, because nothing in your experience suggested such a fate was possible. The day your life changed began like any other. You rose before dawn to help with the morning meal, then walked to the fields where the millet stood tall and golden, ready for harvest. The attack came without warning. Horsemen wearing unfamiliar clothing and speaking languages you had never heard, their weapons gleaming in the early morning light. Some people ran toward the forest, but the raiders had planned their assault carefully, positioning men to cut off escape routes. You remember seeing your spouse seized by two men, your children screaming as they were pulled away in different directions, your own futile attempts to fight back before a heavy blow left you unconscious. When you regained consciousness, you found yourself bound with leather thongs, your feet blistered from walking, surrounded by other captives being marched toward some unknown destination. The journey that followed lasted many days, taking you through landscapes you had never seen, past villages where people watched your passage, with expressions ranging from pity to indifference to commercial interest. At each stopping point, some captives were removed while others were added, creating a constantly changing population of the condemned. You learned to recognize the signs that indicated you were approaching another place of sale, the increase in human activity, the presence of people speaking languages that sounded like commerce rather than ordinary conversation, the smell of unfamiliar foods and the sound of livestock. The first time you saw the ocean, it appeared as an impossibility, a body of water so vast that its opposite shore must lie in another world entirely. The Portuguese trading post where you were held pending sale consisted of stone buildings surrounded by wooden palisades, inside which you could see African laborers performing tasks under the supervision of pale-skinned men whose appearance seemed almost supernatural. Their skin possessed no color, their hair grew straight rather than tightly curled, their eyes appeared in shades you had never seen before. They spoke rapidly among themselves, occasionally addressing their African associates in languages that had been modified through generations of trade contact. These men examined you with the same detachment you might have shown toward a goat or cow you were considering purchasing, checking your teeth, feeling your muscles, asking questions about your background through interpreters who might or might not accurately convey your responses. The waiting period in these coastal barracoons, the Portuguese called them depots or factories, could last anywhere from days to months, depending on the arrival of ships from Europe and the demand for labor in American markets. During this time, you had ample opportunity to observe the complex relationships that had developed between European traders and their African counterparts. The European presence along the coast was tolerated because it served the interests of powerful African kingdoms and merchants who had learned to profit from the trade in human beings. These African intermediaries provided security for the trading posts, arranged for the delivery of captives from inland regions, and facilitated exchanges of European goods for African labor. Without their cooperation, the transatlantic slave trade could not have operated on the scale it achieved. Your eventual transfer to a slave ship occurred during what the Europeans called the loading process, though the term seemed euphemistic for an experience so terrifying that some captives died simply from the psychological shock of it. You were rowed out to the ship in a large canoe, surrounded by other captives who shared your terror of the floating structure that would become your prison. The ship's crew, men from various European nations, who spoke among themselves in languages that had evolved specifically for maritime commerce, received you with the same mixture of efficiency and brutality that characterized their treatment of cargo in general. They stripped you of your remaining clothing, examined your body for signs of disease or injury, then assigned you to a specific location below deck according to some system of classification that remained opaque to you your first days aboard the ship, passed in a haze of sensory overload that made comprehension impossible. The constant motion of the vessel created sensations you had never experienced, causing nausea and disorientation among captives and crew alike. The sounds of the ship, the creaking of timbers, the flapping of sails, the shouted commands of officers, the constant background of human suffering in multiple languages formed a cacophony unlike anything in your previous experience. The smells proved equally overwhelming. The salt of ocean spray mixed with the accumulated stench of human waste, rotting food, disease, and despair. Below deck, you could not tell whether it was day or night, could not distinguish the cries of children from the moans of the dying, could not find any familiar point of reference that might help you understand what was happening or what fate awaited you. As the initial shock of capture and transportation wore off, replaced by the grinding routine of maritime imprisonment, you began to observe patterns that helped you comprehend your situation. The ship's crew operated according to a highly structured hierarchy, with the captain possessing absolute authority over every aspect of life aboard the vessel. The sailors who performed the daily tasks of maintaining the ship and managing the captives seemed to live under conditions only marginally better than your own. They ate more, frequently but not substantially better food. They enjoyed greater freedom of movement but faced their own forms of punishment for infractions. They maintained the fiction of being voluntary participants in the enterprise, though many had joined the crew under circumstances that differed little from your own involuntary presence. Some among them displayed genuine kindness, risking punishment to provide extra food or water to captives they pitied. But such behavior represented individual choice rather than systematic policy. The passage of time became difficult to track in an environment where the natural rhythms of day and night were replaced by artificial schedules determined by shipboard necessities. You learned to recognize the approach of meal times by the sounds of preparation above deck, to identify changes in weather by the ship's motion, to distinguish between ordinary sailing noises and sounds that might indicate danger or the approach of land. You developed relationships with other captives, sometimes through shared languages, sometimes through gestures and expressions that transcended linguistic barriers, sometimes simply through the recognition of shared suffering that created bonds deeper than ordinary friendship. These relationships provided the emotional sustenance necessary for survival, though they also increased the pain of separation when the voyage ended and captives were distributed to different destinations. The daily reality of your existence aboard the ship consisted of finding ways to preserve some sense of yourself as a human being deserving of dignity despite conditions specifically designed to strip you of that sense. You sang songs quietly when you could remember the words, though singing sometimes provoked punishment from the crew who feared that coordinated singing might mask planning for rebellion. You told stories to younger captives who had been separated from their families, though the telling often intensified your own longing for the world you had lost. You tried to maintain personal hygiene despite the impossibility of cleanliness in an environment where water was rationed and privacy did not exist. You performed small acts of resistance, refusing certain foods, maintaining eye contact with captors, helping fellow captives who were weaker than yourself. That demonstrated your lingering autonomy even under conditions of extreme subjugation. The approach of the American continent announced itself through changes in the ship's routine that became obvious, even to those confined below deck. The crew's activity increased, their conversations became animated, they performed tasks related to arrival at port rather than simply maintaining the vessel during its ocean passage. When you were finally brought above deck for extended periods, the policy of keeping captives confined varied according to weather conditions and the captain's assessment of security risks. You could see land in the distance, could observe other ships anchored in the harbor, could witness the complex preparations being made for your sale and distribution to various purchasers. The sight of land provoked mixed emotions, hope that your ordeal might be ending, terror of what awaited you in this unknown place, grief for the life you had lost permanently, anxiety about being separated from the few relationships you had managed to form during the voyage. Your arrival in the Americas represented not liberation, but merely the transition to another form of bondage. The process of being unloaded, examined, cleaned, and prepared for sale involved experiences as dehumanizing as anything you had endured during the ocean crossing. You were handled like livestock, examined for defects that might affect your value, displayed to potential purchasers who spoke about you as if you could not understand their conversations, despite the fact that you could observe their expressions and body language well enough to comprehend their assessments of your worth. The auction process, when it finally occurred, represented the ultimate destruction of whatever family relationships had survived the journey from Africa, as captives were distributed to different purchasers according to market demands, rather than any consideration for human relationships or welfare. As you prepare for sleep, try to hold in your mind the experience of that captive aboard the slave ship, the total loss of control over your own life, the systematic denial of your humanity, the transformation from a person with a name and history into property to be bought and sold. Consider how human beings endure such experiences, what reservoirs of resilience they must draw upon to maintain any sense of themselves as worthy of dignity and freedom. Then reflect on how the systematic treatment of people as commodities, when practiced on such a massive scale, affects not only those who suffer directly, but also the societies that participate in or benefit from such practices. These contemplations prepare us for the next section, where we will examine how the voices of those who experienced the transatlantic slave trade became powerful forces in the movement to abolish it, and how their testimony helped transform moral understanding of human rights and dignity. But wait, before we continue, there's something else to consider. The story you've just heard represents only one perspective among millions who experienced the transatlantic slave trade. What about those who worked aboard these ships, who participated in the capture and transportation of human beings, who benefited financially from the enterprise? How did they understand their roles in this massive system of human exploitation? And what about those who witnessed these practices and found them morally indefensible, who began to question whether any economic benefit could justify such systematic cruelty? These questions will guide our exploration in the next section, where we will examine how the very voices emerging from the slave trade helped generate the moral forces that would eventually destroy it. Now shift your perspective to that of a young English sailor named Thomas, who finds himself signing aboard a slave ship in Liverpool during the spring of 1725. Thomas comes from a working-class family in a northern port city where employment options are limited and wages remain chronically low. He has watched his father struggle to support their family as a dock worker, has seen his elder brothers leave home to seek opportunities elsewhere, and has concluded that maritime employment represents his best chance to earn enough money to eventually establish himself independently. He cannot read or write beyond signing his name, but he possesses the physical strength and willingness to endure hardship that qualifies him for shipboard labor in an era when maritime work involves constant danger and minimal comfort. Thomas's recruitment follows patterns established by the slave trade's need for large numbers of sailors willing to participate in an industry known for its brutality. The ship's agent approaches him in a tavern near the docks, offering wages that seem generous by the standards of ordinary merchant shipping, along with the promise of adventure and exotic experiences that appeal to a young man's desire for excitement beyond the familiar confines of his hometown. The agent explains that the voyage will last approximately 18 months, during which Thomas will visit Africa, the Americas, and various European ports, returning with enough money to purchase a small business or farm. The agent does not emphasize the mortality rates associated with slave ships, the brutal disciplinary practices employed aboard such vessels, or the moral implications of participating in human trafficking, though Thomas has heard rumors about all these aspects of the trade from sailors who have completed such voyages. During the weeks of preparation before departure, Thomas participates in the loading of trade goods that will be exchanged for African captives: textiles manufactured in Manchester, metal goods from Birmingham, firearms produced in various European cities, alcohol distilled from Caribbean sugar and English grain, tobacco from Virginia plantations, various luxury items that serve as currency in African commercial centers. He learns to handle these goods carefully, understanding that their condition upon arrival in Africa will affect their trading value and therefore the profitability of the entire voyage. He observes the ship's transformation from an ordinary merchant vessel to a specialized slave transport, watching as temporary barriers are constructed to separate male from female captives, as additional water casks are loaded to accommodate the increased population that will be carried, as weapons are distributed among the crew to maintain control over potentially rebellious cargo. The departure from Liverpool provides Thomas with his first experience of the emotional complexity associated with slave trading. The ship's crew consists of men from various nations: English, Irish, Dutch, Portuguese, some Africans who have learned European languages and serve as intermediaries. They share little beyond their willingness to participate in a lucrative but dangerous business, and their interactions are characterized by a combination of mutual dependence and deep suspicion. The captain exercises absolute authority, maintaining order through a combination of promised rewards and threatened punishments that ensures compliance with his commands. Thomas quickly learns that complaints about working conditions, questions about the morality of transporting human beings, or suggestions of sympathy for the captives will be met with harsh disciplinary measures that might include flogging, reduction of food rations, or abandonment in foreign ports. The arrival on the African coast exposes Thomas to experiences that challenge his understanding of humanity and commerce. He observes the complex negotiations that occur between European ship captains and African traders, transactions that involve sophisticated commercial practices, multiple languages, established patterns of credit and debt, and the participation of numerous intermediaries who facilitate exchanges between cultures with vastly different concepts of human value and social organization. He learns that the African partners in these transactions come from powerful kingdoms and trading networks that have dominated regional commerce for centuries. that they possess commercial skills equal to or exceeding those of their European counterparts, and that they approach the slave trade with the same combination of profit, motive and moral justification that characterizes European participation in the enterprise, the loading process, the period during which all captives are brought aboard, and the ship is prepared for its Atlantic crossing provides Thomas with his most direct exposure to the human consequences of the trade he has joined. He participates in the physical examination of captives, learning to assess their age, health, and potential market value using criteria established by generations of slave traders. He assists in the maintenance of order among prisoners who understandably resist their confinement, sometimes through violent rebellion, sometimes through passive refusal to eat or cooperate, sometimes through desperate attempts at suicide. He observes the brutality with which resistance is suppressed, understanding that such violence serves the dual purpose of maintaining immediate order while providing examples that discourage future resistance from other captives. The Atlantic crossing itself becomes the defining experience of Thomas's voyage, a period of several months during which the physical and psychological conditions aboard the ship create an environment that transforms participants in ways they could not have anticipated. Initially, Thomas attempts to maintain emotional distance from the captives, viewing them as cargo whose suffering, while regrettable, represents an unfortunate necessity of profitable commerce. But the daily exposure to human suffering on such a massive scale gradually erodes this detachment, forcing him to confront the reality that these men, women, and children possess the same capacity for pain, fear, grief, and hope that characterizes his own emotional experience. He witnesses acts of courage among the captives that equal or exceed anything he has observed among European populations, observes instances of generosity and mutual support that demonstrate the persistence of human dignity under circumstances specifically designed to destroy it, and recognizes behaviors that seem to reflect the same emotional responses he would exhibit under similar conditions. The crew's response to these observations varies considerably. Some sailors maintain their emotional distance through systematic dehumanization of the captives, speaking of them as livestock or merchandise rather than human beings, participating in abuse that reinforces their own sense of superiority and control, developing elaborate justifications for their participation in the trade that emphasize European cultural superiority or economic necessity. Others find their initial attitudes gradually shifting as they recognize the fundamental humanity of their captives, developing relationships that sometimes extend beyond the boundaries of their formal roles, occasionally providing assistance or protection that exceeds their formal obligations. These varying responses create tensions among the crew members themselves, as different individuals struggle to reconcile their participation in systematic human exploitation with their own moral understanding of acceptable behavior. Thomas's personal crisis reaches its climax during a period when disease spreads through the captive population, causing deaths at a rate that threatens the profitability of the voyage. The ship's surgeon determines that confining the sick below deck accelerates the spread of illness and recommends that some captives be allowed to remain above deck, where fresh air might improve their chances of survival. The captain agrees to this modification but assigns Thomas the responsibility of supervising these captives, requiring him to interact directly with individuals who are sick, frightened, and understandably hostile toward their captors. During his hours of watching over these people, Thomas finds himself engaging in conversations, often through gestures and facial expressions rather than shared language, that reveal their individual personalities, their memories of life in Africa, their fears about what awaits them in America, and their hopes for eventual freedom and return to their homeland. One particular captive, a man approximately Thomas's own age who possesses remarkable language learning abilities, becomes the primary vehicle for this cross-cultural communication. Through a combination of English words, the man learns from Thomas, and symbolic gestures they develop together. They manage to exchange information about their respective backgrounds, their families, their reasons for being aboard this ship, and their understanding of the forces that have brought them together under these circumstances. Thomas learns that his companion was captured during a war between kingdoms that have been engaged in conflict for generations, that he possesses skills as a metal worker and farmer that would make him valuable in any society, that he has a wife and children whose fate he does not know, and that he maintains hope of eventual return to his homeland despite the apparent impossibility of such an outcome. The conversations reveal that both men are victims of historical forces they cannot control, though their positions within those forces differ dramatically in terms of power and possibility. The conclusion of Thomas's voyage brings no resolution to the moral conflicts he has experienced. The captives who survive the Atlantic crossing are unloaded, examined, cleaned, and prepared for sale using methods that Thomas now understands are designed to maximize their market value while maintaining the fiction that they are healthy, well-treated individuals whose previous suffering can be ignored or forgotten. He participates in this process with the same mechanical efficiency he has learned from his more experienced shipmates, but he finds himself unable to view these activities with the emotional detachment that characterizes their approach to the work. The relationships he has developed with particular captives create additional emotional complications, as he recognizes that these people, who have become individuals with names, histories, and personalities in his mind, are about to be distributed to various purchasers according to market demands, rather than any consideration for their personal welfare or preferences. Thomas's return to Liverpool provides him with the opportunity to observe how the profits generated by slave trading affect the communities that participate in it. He finds a city transformed by the wealth flowing into its port, with new construction changing the physical landscape, increased employment opportunities improving the economic circumstances of working-class families like his own, and cultural developments reflecting the cosmopolitan experiences of sailors who have visited ports around the Atlantic world. Yet he also observes signs of moral deterioration that accompany this prosperity, the normalization of violence as a tool of social control, the development of elaborate justifications for treating human beings as property, the systematic suppression of information about the human costs of profitable commerce, and the treatment of those who question these practices as dangerous radicals who threaten the community's economic welfare. Thomas's experience illustrates the complex ways in which ordinary people became complicit in the transatlantic slave trade, often through processes that seemed initially to offer only economic opportunity rather than moral compromise. His participation in the system did not result from inherent cruelty or indifference to human suffering, but from a combination of limited economic options, social pressure, gradual habituation to brutal practices, and the psychological mechanisms that allow people to continue functioning under circumstances that might otherwise overwhelm their capacity for moral reasoning. Understanding these processes helps explain how systems of systematic oppression can develop and persist even among populations that might be expected to reject such practices on ethical grounds. As you prepare to drift towards sleep, consider the psychological processes that enabled men like Thomas to participate in the slave trade while maintaining their sense of themselves as decent human beings. Reflect on how economic necessity, social pressure, gradual habituation, and the compartmentalization of moral concerns allow people to become complicit in practices they might otherwise reject. Then consider what parallels might exist in our own time, where sophisticated economic systems sometimes produce human costs that remain hidden from those who benefit from them, or where well-intentioned individuals find themselves participating in institutions whose moral implications they have not fully examined. These contemplations prepare us for our final section, where we will examine how voices from within the slave trade system helped generate the moral forces that would eventually contribute to its destruction. But wait, there's another perspective we haven't yet explored. What about those who witnessed these practices and found them morally indefensible, who began to organize opposition to the slave trade who developed new understandings of human rights and dignity that would eventually reshape the moral landscape of Western civilization. Their story will complete our examination of the voices beneath the decks, showing how the very system designed to silence and dehumanize its captives ultimately generated testimony so powerful that it helped transform human understanding of justice and equality. Shift your attention now to the year 1788, when a remarkable woman named Mary Prince finds herself sitting in a London boarding house, dictating her life story to a woman who has offered to help her escape from domestic servitude. Mary's narrative will eventually become one of the most influential personal accounts of slavery ever published, contributing significantly to the movement that would abolish the transatlantic slave trade throughout the British Empire. But on this particular afternoon, she is simply a woman trying to make sense of experiences that have transformed her from a child born into slavery in Bermuda, into an adult who has chosen to risk everything by speaking publicly about the institution that has shaped every aspect of her existence. Mary's story begins not with her own memories, but with stories her mother told her about life in Africa before their ancestors were captured and transported across the Atlantic. These stories, passed down through generations of enslaved people, preserved fragments of cultural knowledge that slaveholders attempted to suppress, the names of ethnic groups, descriptions of traditional practices, memories of family structures that differed dramatically from the relationships imposed by slavery. Mary's mother told her that their people were skilled farmers and craftspeople, that they possessed sophisticated social organizations that ensured justice and provided for community welfare, that they practiced religions that connected them to spiritual traditions stretching back countless generations. These stories served multiple functions. They provided Mary with a sense of identity that transcended her status as property. They connected her to a heritage that slavery attempted to destroy, and they offered evidence that the people held in bondage possessed complex cultures and capabilities that contradicted slaveholders' claims about African inferiority. Mary's direct experience of slavery began when she was sold away from her family at the age of 12, beginning a pattern of being transferred between owners that would continue throughout her early life. Each sale represented a form of psychological violence that slaveholders used systematically to prevent the development of stable relationships among enslaved people, to eliminate the community ties that might provide support for resistance, and to reinforce the message that enslaved individuals possessed no control over their own lives or futures. Mary's descriptions of these separations reveal their devastating impact not only on those who were sold, but also on those who remained behind, creating communities characterized by constant grief and uncertainty about the fate of loved ones. She writes about watching her mother cry for days after her sister was sold away, about the anxiety that accompanied every rumor of financial difficulty that might force an owner to sell portions of their enslaved workforce, about the psychological trauma of learning to care for people, knowing that relationships could be destroyed at any moment by economic necessity. The work that Mary performed as an enslaved person provides insight into the economic systems that slavery supported throughout the Atlantic world. She describes laboring in salt ponds where the mineral was extracted for export to markets throughout the Americas, working in cotton fields that supplied textile manufacturers in England and New England, performing domestic service for households whose wealth derived from plantation agriculture, and engaging in various forms of craft production that generated income for her owners while providing her with no compensation beyond minimal food and shelter. These descriptions reveal how thoroughly the Atlantic economy had become dependent on enslaved labor, showing that the products of slavery extended far beyond the sugar, tobacco, and cotton that most people associated with plantation agriculture. The salt that preserved meat, the cotton that clothed populations, the domestic services that supported middle-class households, all these aspects of daily life depended on the labor of people held in bondage. Mary's accounts of the physical conditions she endured serve as testimony to the systematic violence that characterized slavery throughout the Atlantic world. She describes working from before dawn until after dark, receiving insufficient food to maintain health, sleeping on bare floors or in spaces shared with animals, wearing clothing inadequate for weather conditions, and receiving medical care only when her illnesses threatened to reduce her economic value to her owners. She writes about beatings administered for minor infractions, about the use of physical punishment to enforce compliance with unreasonable demands, about the psychological violence of being treated as property whose feelings and preferences were completely irrelevant to those who controlled her life. These descriptions serve not merely as personal complaint, but as systematic documentation of practices that slaveholders attempted to hide from public view, providing evidence that contradicted their claims about the benevolent nature of the institution they defended. The most revolutionary aspect of Mary's narrative involves her descriptions of psychological resistance, the ways in which enslaved people maintained their dignity and autonomy despite systematic attempts to destroy both. She writes about secret religious services where enslaved people practiced forms of Christianity that emphasized liberation and justice, about informal educational arrangements where literate enslaved people taught others to read despite laws prohibiting such instruction, about community support networks that provided care for the elderly and disabled, about cultural practices that preserved African traditions while adapting to American circumstances. These accounts reveal that slavery, despite its brutality, failed to achieve its goal of reducing human beings to the status of mere property. Instead, it generated sophisticated forms of resistance that maintained human dignity while working toward eventual freedom. Mary's escape from slavery and her subsequent involvement in the abolitionist movement illustrate how individual testimony could contribute to larger political changes. Her ability to testify about her experiences before British parliamentary committees investigating the slave trade provided legislators with first-hand accounts that contradicted the claims of slaveholders and their supporters. Her participation in public meetings where she spoke about her experiences helped educate British citizens about conditions in their colonies, generating support for abolitionist legislation. Her published narrative reached audiences throughout the English-speaking world, influencing public opinion in ways that contributed to the eventual abolition of the slave trade throughout the British Empire. The impact of Mary's testimony extended beyond its immediate political consequences to help establish new understandings of human rights and social justice. Her narrative demonstrated that enslaved people possessed the intellectual and emotional capacity to analyze their own experiences, to articulate sophisticated critiques of the institutions that oppressed them, and to contribute to political movements aimed at achieving social change. This challenged fundamental assumptions that underlay slavery, the belief that African-descended people were inherently inferior, that they required white supervision to function effectively, that they could not participate meaningfully in political or intellectual life. By speaking for herself, Mary helped establish the principle that oppressed people possessed authority to describe and analyze their own experiences, a concept that would influence subsequent movements for social justice throughout the world. Mary's story represents just one among thousands of individual narratives that contributed to the transformation of moral understanding that led to abolition. Similar testimony came from Olaudah Equiano's autobiography, from the narratives published by Frederick Douglass and other American former slaves, from accounts collected by British and American abolitionist organizations, from legal testimony provided by enslaved people who had gained their freedom through various means. Together, these voices created a body of evidence that made it impossible for supporters of slavery to maintain their claims about the benevolent nature of the institution they defended. They demonstrated that slavery, regardless of how it was justified or regulated, inevitably involved systematic violations of human dignity that contradicted emerging concepts of natural rights and social justice. But the transformation that occurred between the early days of the transatlantic slave trade and its eventual abolition represents one of the most significant changes in human moral understanding in recorded history. The same societies that had developed sophisticated systems for transporting, marketing, and exploiting human beings eventually embraced principles of universal human rights that made such practices morally indefensible. This change did not occur because of abstract philosophical arguments alone, but because the voices of those who experienced slavery firsthand made it impossible for their societies to continue ignoring the human costs of profitable exploitation. As you prepare to conclude your exploration of the voices beneath the decks, consider how individual testimony can contribute to larger processes of social and political change. Reflect on the courage required for people like Mary Prince to speak publicly about experiences that their societies preferred to ignore or deny. Then think about what parallels might exist in our own time, where the voices of those who experience oppression firsthand continue to play crucial roles in movements for social justice. The story of how the transatlantic slave trade generated the voices that helped destroy it demonstrates that even the most powerful systems of exploitation contain within themselves the seeds of their own transformation, as long as there are people willing to speak truth about their experiences, regardless of the personal costs involved. But our exploration is not complete. We've heard from captives, from sailors, from abolitionists, but we haven't yet examined the full scope of how the transatlantic slave trade affected the societies it touched, or how it finally came to an end. These questions will guide our final story, where we will examine the long-term consequences of this massive forced migration and the processes through which it was eventually abolished throughout the Atlantic world. Imagine yourself standing on the deck of a merchant vessel, approaching the island of Barbados in the year 1680, the landscape that reveals itself as you draw nearer bears little resemblance to the Caribbean paradise that will later appear in travel, brochures and honeymoon advertisements. Instead, you see a terrain that has been systematically transformed to serve the single purpose of producing sugar for European markets. The hillsides have been stripped of their original forest cover, replaced by endless fields of tall green cane that sway in the trade winds like a verdant ocean. The coastline is punctuated by loading docks where ships receive barrels of raw sugar and rum for transport across the Atlantic, while delivering the manufactured goods, food supplies and human cargo that keep the island's economy functioning. The transformation of Barbados from a sparsely populated island inhabited by indigenous people who would soon be virtually exterminated to the wealthiest colony in the English Empire has occurred within a single lifetime. This change represents the most dramatic example of how the transatlantic slave trade created entirely new forms of economic organization that generated unprecedented wealth for European investors while producing equally unprecedented human misery for those whose labor created that wealth. The sugar plantations that cover the island operate according to principles specifically designed to maximize production while minimizing costs, with human beings treated as interchangeable components in an industrial process whose sole purpose is the generation of profit. The daily operation of a Barbadian sugar plantation illustrates how thoroughly the slave trade had reshaped economic relationships throughout the Atlantic world. The workday begins before dawn, when overseers rouse the enslaved labor force from their barracks-like housing, counts them to ensure that no one has escaped during the night, then assigns them to tasks that will continue with brief interruptions for food and rest until darkness makes further labor impossible. The cane fields require constant attention throughout their 18-month growing cycle: planting, weeding, fertilizing, harvesting, each task performed by workers who possess detailed knowledge of agricultural techniques, but who receive no recognition for their expertise beyond the meager rations that sustain their capacity for continued labor. During the harvest season, the pace becomes even more intense, as cut cane must be processed immediately in mills that operate 24 hours a day, requiring coordination between field workers, mill workers, and the skilled technicians who maintain the complex machinery that converts cane juice into sugar, crystals, and molasses. The technological sophistication of sugar production in the late 17th century might surprise those who imagined slavery as a system based primarily on brute force, rather than technological innovation. The mills that crush the cane, the boilers that reduce the juice to syrup, the crystallization pans that separate sugar from molasses, the distillation apparatus that converts molasses into rum, all represent cutting-edge engineering solutions to the technical challenges of large-scale agricultural processing. These facilities require constant maintenance and skilled operation, tasks often performed by enslaved craftsmen who possess specialized knowledge that makes them more valuable than field workers, but also more dangerous to the system that exploits them. The integration of human labor with mechanical systems creates an industrial operation that anticipates many features of factory production that will later characterize the Industrial Revolution in Europe. The economic relationships that connect Barbadian plantations to the broader Atlantic economy reveal how completely the slave trade had integrated seemingly distant regions into an interdependent system. The sugar produced on Barbados is purchased by merchants who transport it to New England, where it is converted into rum that will be traded for African captives. The molasses that is a byproduct of sugar production feeds livestock in New England, contributing to the region's agricultural economy. The profits generated by sugar sales flow back to England, where they fund banks, insurance companies, and manufacturing enterprises that help finance the Industrial Revolution. The enslaved people who produce the sugar are purchased from African traders using goods manufactured in Europe, creating a circular flow of commodities and capital that touches nearly every significant economic center in the Atlantic world. The social structure that develops around sugar production reflects the peculiar characteristics of an economy based on slavery. The plantation owners, a small group of wealthy Europeans who may never visit their Caribbean properties, live primarily in London, Bristol, or other English cities, where they enjoy incomes that enable them to purchase political influence, cultural prestige, and luxury goods that distinguish them from the merchants and manufacturers who form the traditional English elite. The managers who actually operate the plantations, overseers, bookkeepers, skilled craftsmen, form a middle tier of colonial society, enjoying privileges that derive from their position as representatives of absentee owners, but also experiencing the psychological pressures that come from supervising systematic human exploitation. The enslaved population, which constitutes the vast majority of the island's inhabitants, creates parallel social institutions, religious practices, educational arrangements, family structures, cultural traditions that maintain African traditions while adapting to American circumstances, generating forms of resistance that range from subtle sabotage to open rebellion, and developing strategies for individual survival that also serve community welfare. The environmental consequences of sugar production prove as dramatic as its social and economic effects. The deforestation required to create cane fields destroys ecosystems that had developed over thousands of years, eliminating habitat for indigenous species while exposing soil to erosion by tropical storms. The monoculture agriculture that sugar requires depletes soil nutrients more rapidly than traditional farming methods, creating a cycle where plantations must expand continuously simply to maintain production levels. The processing facilities that convert cane to sugar require enormous quantities of wood for fuel, leading to further deforestation that alters local climate patterns and water cycles. The waste products of sugar production, bagasse from crushed cane, contaminated water from mill operations, chemical residues from clarification processes, pollute streams and coastal waters, affecting fisheries that provide protein for local populations while also supporting export markets. The demographic transformation of Barbados illustrates how completely the transatlantic slave trade had reshaped population patterns throughout the Americas. By 1680, the island's population consists of approximately 50,000 enslaved Africans and African-descended people, 20,000 European colonists, and a small number of indigenous people who have survived the diseases and violence that accompanied European settlement. This ratio, more than 2 enslaved people for every free person, creates a society characterized by constant fear of rebellion among the dominant minority and ongoing resistance among the oppressed majority. The birth rate among enslaved women remains low due to poor nutrition, exhausting labor, lack of adequate medical care, and the psychological stress of slavery, requiring constant importation of new captives to maintain the labor force. The death rate among all populations remains high due to tropical diseases, inadequate nutrition, contaminated water supplies, and the general unsanitary conditions that characterize 17th century cities regardless of their economic basis. The wealth generated by Barbados and similar sugar islands creates ripple effects that extend throughout the Atlantic economy, but this prosperity rests on foundations of human misery that eventually generate moral opposition among those exposed to its reality. Visitors to the island sometimes express horror at the conditions they observe, the brutal punishments inflicted on enslaved people for minor infractions, the separation of families during sales, the inadequate food and housing provided to workers, the systematic denial of education and religious instruction that might provide psychological comfort or practical skills. These observations contribute to growing doubts about the moral acceptability of slavery that will eventually coalesce into the abolitionist movement, though such concerns remain minority opinions during the period when sugar production reaches its peak profitability. As you drift towards sleep, consider how economic systems can transform societies so completely that they reshape not only material conditions, but also moral understanding, cultural practices, and environmental relationships. Reflect on how the pursuit of profit can create incentives for treating human beings as commodities, and how such practices can become normalized within societies that benefit from them. And think about what parallels might exist in our own time, where global economic integration sometimes creates benefits for some populations while generating severe costs for others, and where the moral implications of economic relationships remain subject to ongoing debate and evolving understanding. But the story of sugar represents only one aspect of how the transatlantic slave trade transformed Atlantic economies. The system that developed around sugar production created precedents and patterns that would be applied to other forms of agricultural and industrial production, generating consequences that extended far beyond the Caribbean islands where these developments first occurred. Our next section will examine how the economic logic of slavery spread throughout the Americas, creating new forms of social organization while also generating the contradictions that would eventually contribute to the system's destruction. Shift your attention now to the Carolina frontier in the year 1790, where the invention of the cotton gin has just begun to transform the economic prospects of American agriculture. Eli Whitney's simple mechanical device, a hand-cranked machine with wire, teeth that pulls cotton fibers away from their seeds, has solved the bottleneck that previously made cotton production economically unfeasible throughout much of the American South. Before this invention, separating a pound of cotton fiber from its seeds required approximately 1 full day of manual labor by an experienced worker, making cotton expensive compared to wool, flax, or other textile fibers. The cotton gin reduces this processing time to minutes rather than hours, suddenly making cotton cultivation enormously profitable for planters who possess both suitable land and access to the large labor force required for plantation agriculture. The expansion of cotton production represents the final, most extensive application of the economic principles that had been developed through earlier experiments with sugar, tobacco, and rice cultivation. Cotton possesses several characteristics that make it particularly suitable for exploitation through enslaved labor. It requires intensive cultivation during the growing season, demands careful processing immediately after harvest, benefits from economies of scale that reward large plantations over small farms, and produces a commodity whose market value justifies the high costs associated with maintaining a captive labor force. The combination of these factors creates economic incentives that drive the rapid expansion of cotton cultivation throughout the American South during the early decades of the 19th century, generating demand for enslaved labor that helps revitalize the transatlantic slave trade even as moral opposition to human trafficking begins to gain political influence. The daily operation of a cotton plantation differs in important respects from other forms of agricultural slavery, creating new patterns of labor organization that reflect the specific requirements of cotton cultivation. The work begins in early spring with soil preparation that requires clearing new ground, plowing and harrowing existing fields, and building the drainage systems necessary to prevent waterlogging that can destroy cotton crops. Planting occurs during late spring, when seeds must be placed at specific depths and intervals to ensure optimal growing conditions. The summer months bring the crucial cultivation period, when workers must remove weeds that compete with cotton plants for nutrients and water, often while working in temperatures that exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity levels that make breathing difficult. Harvest occurs during autumn, when matured cotton must be picked carefully to avoid damaging the delicate fibers that determine the crop's market value. The technological development associated with cotton production extends far beyond the invention of the gin, encompassing a range of innovations that create increasingly sophisticated systems for processing and transporting agricultural commodities. The development of steamboat transportation along southern rivers enables planters to transport cotton to market more efficiently, reducing costs while also facilitating the movement of enslaved people between different regions according to labor demands. The construction of railroads during the 1830s and 1840s creates new transportation networks that connect inland plantations to coastal ports, enabling the South Central states to participate in cotton production despite their distance from natural waterways. The development of textile manufacturing in New England and Europe creates expanding markets for cotton fiber, ensuring that increased production can be absorbed by industrial economies that are themselves being transformed by technological innovation. The expansion of cotton production creates ripple effects that reshape the entire American economy, generating forms of regional interdependence that will contribute to the sectional conflicts that eventually produce civil war. The textile mills of New England require constant supplies of cotton fiber to maintain their operations, creating economic relationships that connect northern industrial workers to southern plantation agriculture. The merchants and shippers who transport cotton to market derive substantial portions of their income from this trade, generating urban centers like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, whose prosperity depends partly on southern agricultural exports. The financial institutions that provide credit to cotton planters, including banks, insurance companies, and factors who advance money against future crops, develop sophisticated systems for managing the risks associated with agricultural production. But these institutions also create national networks that spread the impact of regional economic disruptions throughout the entire country. The social structure that develops around cotton production creates new forms of racial hierarchy that extend far beyond the plantation system itself. The ideology that justifies slavery, claims about African inferiority, assertions about the benevolent nature of slavery compared to northern wage labor, arguments about the economic necessity of maintaining plantation agriculture becomes entrenched throughout southern society, influencing everything from educational curricula to religious practices to political representation. The legal system that supports slavery creates precedents for racial discrimination that will persist long after slavery itself has been abolished, establishing patterns of segregation and inequality that continue to affect American society into the present day. The cultural practices that develop around plantation life, music, literature, religious traditions, create distinctively Southern forms of expression that reflect the complex relationships between different populations whose lives are shaped by their positions within the slave system. The environmental consequences of cotton expansion prove equally dramatic. As the drive for increased production leads to the rapid exploitation of Southern agricultural resources, Cotton cultivation depletes soil nutrients more rapidly than traditional farming methods, requiring constant expansion into new territories simply to maintain production levels. The deforestation that accompanies this expansion destroys wildlife habitat while also eliminating the ecological buffers that help regulate local climate and water cycles. The intensive cultivation practices associated with cotton, particularly the use of single-crop agriculture over large areas, create conditions that encourage pest infestations and plant diseases, requiring increasingly sophisticated management techniques that are not always available to 19th century farmers. The transportation networks that connect cotton plantations to markets require substantial investments in infrastructure that alter landscapes, while also creating pollution associated with steamboat and railroad operations. The international dimensions of cotton production connect American slavery to global economic systems in ways that make the institution more difficult to abolish than earlier forms of slavery had been. British textile manufacturers, who dominated global cotton textile production during the early 19th century, become increasingly dependent on American cotton supplies, creating political pressures that discourage British intervention in American slavery disputes. The French and German textile industries also rely heavily on American cotton, generating similar constraints on European opposition to slavery. The banking systems that provide credit to cotton planters include institutions based in London, Paris, and Amsterdam, creating international financial relationships that spread the impact of any disruption to cotton production throughout the entire Atlantic economy. These international connections help explain why the American Civil War, which was fought primarily over the future of slavery, generated economic crises that affected countries throughout Europe and beyond. The expansion of cotton production also creates new patterns of resistance among enslaved people, who develop sophisticated strategies for protecting their interests while working within the constraints imposed by the slave system. Some resistance takes the form of subtle sabotage, working slowly, damaging equipment, misallocating resources in ways that reduce plantation efficiency, while avoiding punishment that might result from more overt forms of opposition. Other resistance involves escape attempts that take advantage of the expanding transportation networks to move enslaved people away from their owners and toward northern states or Canada, where slavery has been abolished. Still, other resistance focuses on maintaining cultural practices and family relationships that slavery attempts to disrupt, creating underground networks that preserve African traditions while also supporting practical forms of mutual assistance among enslaved populations. As you prepare to drift towards sleep, consider how economic incentives can create systems that become so embedded in social, cultural, and political relationships that they resist change even when their moral problems become obvious. Reflect on how the pursuit of profit can generate forms of environmental destruction, social inequality, and cultural conflict that persist long after the original economic benefits have been realized. Then think about what this history might suggest about the challenges involved in addressing contemporary problems where economic interests conflict with moral principles or long-term social welfare. The story of cotton demonstrates how the economic logic of slavery extended its influence far beyond the plantation system itself, creating obstacles to abolition that required massive social upheaval to overcome. But our exploration of the economic impact of the transatlantic slave trade is still incomplete. We've examined sugar and cotton, but we haven't yet considered how the system finally came to an end, or what happened to the societies and economies that had become dependent on slavery when they were forced to develop alternatives to human exploitation. These questions will guide our final section, where we will examine the processes through which the transatlantic slave trade was abolished and the long-term consequences of this massive historical transformation. Now transport yourself to the year 1807, when the British Parliament debates legislation that will abolish the transatlantic slave trade throughout the British Empire. The chamber where this debate occurs represents the culmination of more than 2 decades of political organizing, public education, and moral persuasion carried out by abolitionist activists whose efforts have transformed what initially appeared to be an impossible crusade into legislation that seems increasingly likely to pass. The arguments presented during these debates reveal how thoroughly the moral understanding of human rights had evolved since the transatlantic slave trade began 3 centuries earlier, while also demonstrating the complex economic calculations that influence political decision-making even among those who accepted the moral arguments against slavery. The economic arguments presented by both supporters and opponents of abolition illustrate the complicated relationships between moral principles and material interests that characterized early 19th century British politics. Proponents of the slave trade argue that abolition will destroy a commerce that generates enormous wealth for British merchants, ship owners, and investors, while also depriving Caribbean colonies of the labor force necessary to maintain sugar production that provides significant tax revenue for the British government. They claim that the economic disruption caused by abolition will produce unemployment in port cities, reduce national income from colonial trade, and weaken Britain's position in global commercial competition with countries like France and Spain that continue to participate in slave trading. These arguments appeal to legislators who are concerned about maintaining British economic supremacy during a period when the Industrial Revolution is creating new forms of wealth, while also generating social tensions that require careful management. The counter-arguments presented by abolitionists reveal how thoroughly they have studied the economic dimensions of the slave trade, understanding that moral appeals alone will be insufficient to overcome entrenched commercial interests. They demonstrate that the slave trade actually generates less wealth for Britain than its supporters claim, showing that many slave ships operate at marginal profits while also creating significant risks for investors and sailors who participate in the trade. They argue that the development of breeding programs among enslaved populations will provide sufficient labor for Caribbean plantations without requiring continued participation in the international slave trade, though this argument requires them to accept the sexual exploitation and family disruption that such programs necessarily involve. They suggest that resources currently devoted to slave trading could be more profitably invested in other forms of commerce, particularly industrial production and legitimate trade with African societies that are being disrupted by the slave trade. The moral arguments against the slave trade represent perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of the parliamentary debates, revealing fundamental changes in how British society understands the relationship between economic interests and human dignity. Abolitionist speakers emphasize the systematic violence that characterizes every aspect of the slave trade, from the initial capture of African people through their transportation across the Atlantic to their sale and exploitation in American markets. They present testimony from former slaves like Olaudah Equiano and Mary Prince, whose personal narratives provide detailed accounts of experiences that contradict slaveholders' claims about the benevolent nature of the institution they defend. They appeal to Christian principles about the equality of all human beings before God, arguing that the systematic exploitation of African people represents a fundamental violation of religious teachings that should guide British society. The political coalition that supports abolition illustrates how social movements can create alliances among groups with different interests and perspectives, united by their opposition to a particular form of injustice. Evangelical Christians provide much of the moral fervor that drives the abolitionist movement, motivated by their belief that all human beings possess souls worthy of salvation and their consequent rejection of racial hierarchies that justify slavery. Quakers contribute organizational skills and financial resources developed through their participation in various humanitarian causes, while also providing examples. Imagine yourself as a British naval officer stationed off the coast of West Africa in the year 1835. Your ship, HMS Pluto, patrols the waters between Sierra Leone and the Gold Coast, tasked with enforcing the 1807 Act that abolished the transatlantic slave trade throughout the British Empire. The ironies of your position are not lost on you. You serve a nation that spent 3 centuries perfecting the business of human trafficking, now attempting to prevent other countries from continuing practices that Britain itself helped establish and refine. The merchant vessels you stop and search might be carrying enslaved people from African ports to destinations throughout the Americas, continuing a commerce that remains legal in many nations despite British opposition. Your daily routine consists of monitoring shipping lanes where slave vessels might attempt to pass undetected, boarding suspicious ships to inspect their cargo, and escorting captured slavers to Freetown where British colonial authorities process both vessels and their human cargo. The captives you liberate arrive in conditions that mirror those described by earlier generations of enslaved people, chained together in cramped holds, suffering from malnutrition, disease, and psychological trauma. Uncertain whether their rescue represents genuine liberation or merely a transition to another form of bondage, the naval personnel under your command face their own moral challenges as they witness suffering they have been sent to prevent but cannot entirely alleviate. Since the resources available for rescue, operations never seem adequate to address the scope of human misery you encounter. The international dimensions of your enforcement efforts reveal how complex the political landscape has become since Britain embraced abolition. Spanish, Portuguese, French, and American vessels continue to participate in the slave trade, often flying false flags or employing other subterfuges to avoid British patrols. The Brazilian ships you intercept represent perhaps the most persistent violators, since Brazil's independence from Portugal has created a political situation where British diplomatic pressure carries less weight than it might with European nations. The African kingdoms that have grown dependent on slave trading revenues sometimes resist British interference in their commercial affairs, creating tension between humanitarian objectives and respect for national sovereignty. The treaties Britain negotiates with various nations to suppress the slave trade often include provisions for financial compensation to slave traders, a recognition that economic interests continue to influence moral decisions even among those who publicly oppose human trafficking. The economic consequences of abolition manifest themselves through multiple channels that affect both former participants in the slave trade and the communities that depended on it. British merchants who had invested heavily in slave ships, trading posts, and related infrastructure struggled to find equally profitable alternatives, leading to financial losses that ripple through port cities like Liverpool, Bristol, and London. The West African kingdoms that had developed commercial relationships with European slave traders find their traditional sources of revenue disrupted, while also discovering that legitimate commerce in palm oil, peanuts, and other agricultural products generates lower profits and requires different forms of organization than the slave trade had employed. The Caribbean colonies that had depended on continuous infusions of enslaved labor must develop systems for maintaining their workforce through natural reproduction, a transition that requires improving living conditions and family stability among enslaved populations that plantation owners had previously viewed as temporary laborers rather than permanent community members. The transformation of British attitudes towards slavery illustrates how moral understanding can evolve rapidly once new perspectives gain influence within a society. Within a single generation, Britain has moved from being the world's leading slave-trading nation to becoming the primary international force opposing the practice. This change reflects not simply the triumph of humanitarian sentiment over economic interest, but also a fundamental shift in how British society understands the relationship between commerce and morality, national interest and human rights, cultural superiority, and cross-cultural interaction. The religious groups that have provided much of the energy behind the abolitionist movement, particularly Quakers and evangelical Christians, have succeeded in persuading their fellow citizens that participation in systematic human exploitation contradicts basic Christian principles about the equality of all people before God, while also arguing that legitimate commerce can generate prosperity without requiring moral compromise. The technological innovations that support suppression efforts represent unintended consequences of industrial development, created partly by profits generated through slavery, steam-powered vessels enabled British patrol ships to pursue faster-moving slave vessels, while also providing the reliable transportation schedules necessary for systematic enforcement of anti-slavery regulations. The improved medical knowledge that helps naval personnel survive the disease environment of the West. African coast has been developed partly through research conducted by physicians who gained experience treating both European sailors and African captives aboard slave ships. The communication systems that enable coordination between naval patrols and colonial officials, telegraph lines, improved postal services, regular shipping schedules have been established partly through investments made possible by wealth accumulated through earlier participation in slave trading. The psychological impact of enforcement duty affects naval personnel in ways that parallel the experiences of earlier generations of slave ship crew members, though with significant differences that reflect changing moral understanding of the trade. Sailors who participate in rescue operations sometimes develop relationships with liberated captives that challenge their previous assumptions about African people, discovering intellectual and emotional capabilities that contradict the racial stereotypes prevalent within their society. The exposure to systematic human suffering creates trauma that many sailors find difficult to discuss or understand, leading some to question the value of humanitarian missions that can rescue only a small fraction of the people being trafficked across the Atlantic. The moral certainty that characterizes official rhetoric about abolition sometimes seems inadequate when confronted with the practical challenges of enforcing change within societies that do not share British objections to slavery. The transition from suppression of the international slave trade to abolition of slavery itself requires addressing forms of human exploitation that occur within national boundaries rather than across international waters. The British West Indies represent the first major test of how an industrialized society can eliminate slavery while attempting to preserve the economic benefits that slavery had created, since these colonies contain substantial enslaved populations whose labor generates significant tax revenue for the British government. The apprenticeship system that replaces slavery in 1834 represents an attempt to balance humanitarian objectives with economic interests, requiring formerly enslaved people to continue working for their previous owners under conditions that supposedly prepare them for eventual freedom while also ensuring continued production of sugar and other export commodities. The apprenticeship system fails to achieve either its humanitarian or its economic objectives, proving unpopular among both former slaves who resent continued restrictions on their freedom and former owners who resent reduced control over their workforce. Former apprentices frequently refused to work at the pace or intensity that slavery had required, leading to reduced plantation productivity that concerns colonial officials and metropolitan investors. Former owners discover that managing free laborers requires different skills and attitudes than managing enslaved people, and many prove unable or unwilling to make the necessary adjustments. The costs of maintaining the administrative system that supervises apprenticeships exceed the revenues generated by their labor, creating financial pressures that encourage early termination of the experimental system. These failures provide valuable lessons about the difficulties involved in transitioning from slave to free labor, though the application of these lessons to other contexts remains limited by the specific circumstances that characterize British colonial policy during this period. The compensation paid to slave owners when apprenticeship finally ends in 1838 represents one of the largest government expenditures in British history up to that time, revealing the political influence that property owners continue to exercise even after their right to own human beings has been abolished. The 20 million was distributed among approximately 40,000 slave owners throughout the British Empire provides substantial windfalls for individuals who claim ownership rights over approximately 800,000 formerly enslaved people, though the payments rarely equal the full market value of the human property being relinquished. The distribution of these funds creates new patterns of investment and consumption that ripple through the British economy. with some recipients investing their compensation in industrial enterprises that contribute to economic expansion, while others squander their windfalls on luxury goods or speculative ventures that prove financially disastrous. The payment of compensation also establishes the principle that property rights, even in human beings, deserve protection when social policy changes require their elimination, a precedent that influences subsequent debates about social reform throughout the 19th century. The transformation in British attitudes toward slavery that occurs between 1807 and 1838 illustrates how rapidly moral understanding can evolve when new perspectives gain influence within a society, but also demonstrates the complex ways in which economic interests and political power structures adapt to accommodate changing values without fundamentally altering underlying relationships of exploitation. The British public's embrace of abolitionist principles reflects genuine moral revulsion at the systematic violation of human dignity that slavery represents. But the implementation of abolition occurs through mechanisms that protect established interests, while gradually modifying the specific forms through which exploitation occurs. The persistence of racial discrimination, economic inequality, and social hierarchy within British society despite formal rejection of slavery suggests that eliminating particular institutions of oppression does not automatically address the broader patterns of domination that support them. As you prepare to drift towards sleep, consider how societies can maintain moral commitments to human dignity while also participating in economic systems that create incentives for exploiting vulnerable populations. Reflect on how the transition from slave to free labor requires addressing not only formal legal relationships, but also the cultural assumptions, economic structures, and political institutions that support various forms of social hierarchy. Then think about what lessons this historical experience might offer for addressing contemporary forms of systematic oppression that persist despite formal rejection of the principles that justify them. The aftermath of abolition demonstrates that ending specific institutions of exploitation represents only the beginning of the work required to create genuinely equitable social relationships. Transport yourself now to the United States in the year 1850, where the issue of slavery has become so divisive that it threatens to destroy the federal union that Americans created 3/4 of a century earlier. The political crisis, you observe, results from conflicting approaches to addressing the fundamental contradiction between the nation's founding principles, the assertion in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and possess natural rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the reality that approximately 4 million people are held in bondage throughout the southern states. This contradiction has plagued American politics since independence, but westward expansion, industrial development, and the emergence of organized abolitionism have intensified conflicts over slavery's future to a point where compromise seems increasingly impossible. The economic expansion that drives American growth during the early 19th century creates new forms of conflict between northern and southern regions that extend far beyond the specific issue of slavery itself. The industrial development of the North generates demand for infrastructure improvements, railroads, canals, roads, bridges that require substantial government investment and create precedents for expanded federal authority over economic development. The southern economy, still dominated by plantation agriculture, requires different forms of public investment, harbor improvements, river navigation, coastal defenses, but also depends on maintaining state government authority over labor relations and social organization that might be threatened by expanded federal power. The tariff policies that protect northern manufacturing, while increasing costs for southern consumers, create additional tensions that reflect different regional approaches to economic development and international trade. The political crisis of 1850 illustrates how completely slavery had reshaped American political institutions, creating conflicts over basic questions of governance that the constitutional system struggled to resolve. The admission of new Western states raises fundamental questions about Congress's authority to regulate slavery within federal territories, with Northern politicians arguing that the federal government possesses power to limit slavery's expansion, while Southern leaders claim that such restrictions violate constitutional protections for property rights. The Fugitive Slave Act, included in the Compromise legislation of 1850, requires Northern states to participate in returning escaped slaves to their owners, creating conflicts between federal law and state policies that oppose slavery, while also forcing white Northerners to confront the reality of human trafficking in ways they had previously been able to avoid. The personal liberty laws passed by Northern states in response to federal fugitive slave requirements demonstrate how political conflicts over slavery are generating constitutional crises that challenge basic assumptions about federalism and states' rights. The emergence of the Underground Railroad represents one of the most dramatic examples of how moral opposition to slavery could generate organized resistance to federal law, creating precedents for civil disobedience that would influence subsequent movements for social justice throughout American history. The network of safe houses, escape routes, and secret communication systems that assist fugitive slaves involves thousands of participants, both African American and white, who risk substantial penalties to help enslaved people reach freedom in northern states or Canada. The Underground Railroad operates not as a single organization, but as a decentralized movement whose participants share moral commitments to human dignity and social justice that override their obligations to obey laws they consider fundamentally unjust. The stories of individual escapes, like those of Harriet Tubman, who returns repeatedly to the South to rescue family members and strangers despite substantial bounties offered for her capture, become powerful examples of how ordinary people can resist systematic oppression, regardless of the personal costs involved. They become literary and cultural expressions that emerge from the American crisis reveal how thoroughly slavery has penetrated American consciousness, generating artistic, intellectual, and spiritual responses that attempt to address the moral contradictions permeating American society. The publication of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852 creates a sensation whose impact extends far beyond its initial literary audience, selling more than 300,000 copies during its first year of publication, while also generating theatrical adaptations, musical compositions, and visual art that extend its influence throughout American culture. Stowe's novel personalizes the political debates over slavery by creating characters whose experiences evoke emotional responses that transcend abstract arguments about constitutional interpretation or economic policy, demonstrating how cultural expression can contribute to political change by transforming moral understanding among mass audiences. The Southern responses to Stowe's work, including novels that defend slavery as a benevolent institution while attacking Northern industrial conditions, illustrate how cultural conflict can both reflect and intensify political divisions throughout an entire society. The legal confrontations that result from attempts to enforce fugitive slave requirements generate precedents for judicial activism that will influence American constitutional development for generations after slavery itself has been abolished. The Supreme Court's decision in Prigg versus Pennsylvania, 1842, establishes that federal law supersedes state legislation regarding fugitive slaves, strengthening national authority over civil rights issues, while also demonstrating how judicial interpretation can create constitutional principles that extend far beyond the specific cases being decided. The Dred Scott decision, 1857, attempts to resolve constitutional conflicts over slavery by asserting that African Americans possess no rights that white Americans are obligated to respect, creating a legal principle so extreme that it helps generate the political coalition that will eventually abolish slavery through constitutional amendment rather than judicial interpretation. These cases illustrate how legal systems can become vehicles for resolving political conflicts while also creating precedents that influence Subsequent social policy. International implications of American slavery demonstrate how thoroughly the institution has become integrated into global economic systems that extend far beyond the specific regions where slavery is practiced. British textile manufacturers continue to rely on American cotton supplies despite their country's formal rejection of slavery, creating economic relationships that limit British diplomatic pressure on American slavery policy. The banking systems that provide credit to American cotton planters include institutions based in London, Paris, and Amsterdam, creating international financial networks that spread the impact of American slavery throughout the entire Atlantic economy. The commercial relationships that connect southern plantations to northern factories, British mills and European consumers create incentives for maintaining production levels that depend on enslaved labor regardless of moral objections to the system that generates such commodities. The psychological impact of slavery on American society creates forms of moral injury that extend far beyond those who experience slavery directly, generating guilt, denial, rationalization, and projection among white Americans that will influence racial relationships long after slavery itself has been abolished. Many white Northerners express horror at Southern slavery while also benefiting from economic relationships that depend on cotton production, creating moral contradictions that they resolve through various forms of psychological compartmentalization. Many white Southerners defend slavery as a benevolent institution, while also recognizing that their society's prosperity requires systematic human exploitation, generating defensive responses that attribute criticisms of slavery to jealousy, fanaticism, or ignorance about actual conditions within the slave system. These psychological adaptations create patterns of racial thinking that persist throughout American society, regardless of regional differences in formal attitudes towards slavery. The transformation that occurs between 1850 and 1865 illustrates how rapidly political institutions can evolve when moral conflicts become too intense to manage through existing mechanisms of compromise and accommodation. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, based partly on opposition to slavery's expansion despite acceptance of its continuation where it already exists, demonstrates how political systems can become vehicles for expressing moral values that previous generations had been unable to implement through government policy. The secession of Southern states following Lincoln's election represents an attempt to preserve slavery through political independence. But this effort ultimately provokes the military conflict that will result in slavery's abolition throughout the United States. The Emancipation Proclamation issued during this conflict transforms military necessity into moral necessity, using presidential wartime powers to attack slavery directly rather than merely limiting its geographical expansion. As you drift towards sleep, consider how political systems can become vehicles for expressing moral values while also remaining subject to economic and social pressures that limit their capacity for implementing justice. Reflect on how the American experience illustrates both the possibilities and limitations of democratic institutions for addressing systematic injustice, and how the resolution of political conflicts sometimes requires violence that exceeds what peaceful compromise mechanisms can prevent. And think about what this history might suggest about the relationship between moral principle and political practice in contemporary societies that continue to struggle with various forms of systematic oppression despite formal commitments to human equality and dignity. The American Civil War demonstrates that political institutions can evolve to reflect changing moral understanding, but also reveals the terrible costs that such transformations sometimes require. Shift your attention now to Brazil in the year 1888, where the final act of Atlantic emancipation is about to unfold. The passage of the Golden Law on May 13th abolishes slavery throughout Brazil, making this the last country in the Americas to eliminate the institution that has shaped its society since Portuguese colonization began in the 16th century. The circumstances surrounding this final abolition reveal how thoroughly the transatlantic slave trade had transformed the societies it touched, while also demonstrating how the economic, political, and cultural relationships created by slavery continued to influence social policy long after the trade itself had been suppressed. The story of Brazilian emancipation provides insight into the complex processes through which societies finally eliminate institutions that have become fundamental to their organization, while also suggesting the long-term consequences of such transformations for societies, attempting to develop new forms of social and economic relationships. The political context surrounding Brazilian abolition illustrates how thoroughly the issue of slavery had become integrated into broader conflicts over national development and international relationships. Throughout the 19th century, Brazil had faced increasing diplomatic pressure from Britain to suppress both the slave trade and slavery itself, with British officials employing various forms of economic coercion to achieve compliance with their humanitarian objectives. The British Navy had been intercepting Brazilian slave ships since the 1830s, creating tensions that threatened Brazil's access to international markets, while also demonstrating how industrial power could be employed to enforce moral standards throughout the global economy. The Paraguayan War, 1864-1870, had created additional pressures for change, as Brazil's military forces included large numbers of enslaved people who were promised freedom in exchange for military service, creating precedents for broader emancipation, while also revealing how slavery had become incompatible with modern concepts of citizenship and national belonging. The economic transformation of Brazil during the 19th century had created new forms of regional conflict over slavery that parallel similar developments in the United States, though with distinctive characteristics that reflect Brazil's particular historical circumstances. The expansion of coffee production in the southeastern provinces had created demand for labor that could no longer be met through the slave trade, since British suppression efforts had made it increasingly difficult and expensive to transport captives from Africa to American markets. The growth of urban centers like Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo had created new forms of employment that competed with plantation agriculture for labor, while also generating middle-class populations whose economic interests differed from those of plantation owners. The development of transportation infrastructure, particularly railroad construction, had created demands for wage labor that could not be met through traditional slaveholding arrangements, while also demonstrating how industrial development required different forms of labor organization than plantation agriculture. The political coalition that supports abolition in Brazil demonstrates how social movements can create alliances among groups with different interests and perspectives, united by their recognition that slavery has become incompatible with modern concepts of national development and international respectability. Liberal politicians argue that slavery contradicts constitutional principles about citizenship and equality that should guide Brazilian law, while also pointing out that continued reliance on slavery marginalizes Brazil within the community of civilized nations. Conservative elements initially resist abolition, but gradually accept it as preferable to the social instability that might result from continued attempts to maintain an institution that has become increasingly difficult to enforce. Urban commercial interests support abolition because they believe free labor will be more productive than slave labor, while also recognizing that emancipation will expand consumer markets by increasing the purchasing power of formerly enslaved people. The role of enslaved people in achieving their own liberation illustrates how subordinate populations can influence social change even when they lack formal political power or legal rights. Throughout the 19th century, enslaved Brazilians had employed various forms of resistance that gradually undermined the system's effectiveness, while also demonstrating their capacity for autonomous action. Escape attempts had created networks of maroon communities, quilombos, that provided refuge for runaways while also forcing colonial authorities to devote resources to capturing fugitives. Work slowdowns and sabotage had reduced plantation productivity while also requiring increased expenditures for supervision and discipline. The maintenance of African cultural practices, religious traditions, family relationships, languages, crafts had preserve community solidarity while also demonstrating that enslaved people possessed sophisticated cultural knowledge that contradicted claims about their intellectual inferiority. The process through which abolition is finally achieved, the passage of the Golden Law on May 13, 1888, illustrates both the possibilities and limitations of legislative action for addressing systematic injustice. The law itself is remarkably brief and simple, stating merely that slavery is hereby declared extinct in Brazil without providing detailed provisions for assisting the transition from slavery to freedom. Princess Isabel, who signs the legislation while serving as regent during her father's absence in Europe, becomes a symbol of humanitarian reform, despite having possessed limited personal influence over the political process that produced abolition. The absence of compensation for slave owners reflects the political strength of the abolitionist movement at the moment of final victory, but also creates financial pressures that will affect how Brazilian society addresses the economic consequences of emancipation. The lack of assistance programs for freed people means that their transition to economic independence will depend largely on their own resources and initiative, creating conditions that will influence patterns of poverty and social inequality for generations to come. The international response to Brazilian abolition demonstrates how the suppression of the transatlantic slave trade had helped reshape global economics relationships while also creating new forms of international cooperation based on shared humanitarian principles. British officials congratulate Brazil for joining the community of civilized nations that have rejected slavery, while also offering diplomatic and economic incentives designed to encourage continued cooperation in suppressing illegal slave trading that might persist despite formal abolition. American observers note the contrast between Brazil's peaceful emancipation and the violent conflict required to eliminate slavery in the United States, though they sometimes overlook the different circumstances that made peaceful transition possible in Brazil. European intellectuals celebrate Brazilian abolition as evidence that moral progress can occur without revolutionary violence, while also recognizing that the elimination of slavery represents only the first step in creating genuinely equitable social relationships. The economic consequences of abolition throughout the Americas reveal how thoroughly societies had become dependent on institutions that they had created through participation in the transatlantic slave trade, while also demonstrating their capacity for adaptation when required to develop alternative forms of social and economic organization. The sugar islands of the Caribbean experienced significant declines in production during the years immediately following emancipation, as formerly enslaved people choose to work their own small plots of land rather than continue laboring on plantations under conditions that differ little from slavery itself. The coffee plantations of Brazil maintain production levels more successfully, partly because their location in temperate highlands provides more attractive working conditions than tropical lowlands, but also because Brazilian abolition occurs within a different political and economic context than Caribbean emancipation. The cotton economies of the American South experience perhaps the most dramatic transformation, as the Civil War that eliminates slavery also destroys much of the region's physical infrastructure, while also disrupting international markets for southern agricultural products. The long-term demographic consequences of abolition reflect how completely the transatlantic slave trade had reshaped population patterns throughout the Americas, while also demonstrating how the end of slavery creates new patterns of migration, urbanization, and community formation that continue to influence social development into the present day. The African-descended populations that had been concentrated in plantation regions gradually dispersed throughout the Americas, creating new communities in urban centers while also maintaining connections to rural areas that provide economic opportunities and cultural continuity. The system of racial classification that had developed to justify slavery persists despite formal rejection of the institution, influencing patterns of social mobility, political participation, and cultural expression that distinguish American societies from their European counterparts. The family relationships that had been disrupted by slavery begin to stabilize, creating new forms of kinship solidarity while also preserving memory of the historical experience that had shaped previous generations' lives. That these psychological dimensions of emancipation illustrate how the elimination of formal slavery does not automatically resolve the trauma, identity conflicts, and cultural dislocation that had been created through centuries of systematic human exploitation. Formerly enslaved people must develop new understandings of themselves as free individuals while also maintaining connections to cultural traditions that had helped them survive. Slavery's assault on their dignity and autonomy. Former slave owners must adjust to social relationships that no longer provide absolute authority while also developing new justifications for economic inequality and social hierarchy that can replace racial slavery as foundations for their privileged status. Entire societies must create new civic myths, educational curricula, and cultural symbols that can explain their history without requiring either complete rejection of their past or acceptance of systematic injustice as permanent. Features of social organization. As you prepare to conclude this exploration of the transatlantic slave trade's long shadow, consider how historical institutions can continue to influence social relationships long after their formal elimination, creating patterns of thought, behavior, and expectation that persist across generations despite conscious efforts to replace them with more equitable alternatives. Reflect on how the process of moral progress involves not simply the rejection of obviously unjust practices, but also the challenging work of creating new institutions, relationships, and understandings that can prevent the re-emergence of systematic oppression in different forms. Then think about what this history suggests about the ongoing responsibility of contemporary societies to acknowledge and address the continuing consequences of historical injustice, particularly when those consequences continue to affect the lives of people who had no responsibility for creating the institutions that produced such harm. The story of the transatlantic slave trade demonstrates that human beings possess the capacity for both extraordinary cruelty and remarkable resilience, that economic systems can generate wealth while also producing suffering that seems impossible to justify by any measure of profit or efficiency, and that moral understanding can evolve in ways that eventually reject practices previously considered acceptable by the majority of reasonable people. But this history also reveals how difficult it is to eliminate the consequences of systematic injustice once they have become embedded in social, economic, and cultural relationships that extend across centuries and continents. The long shadow cast by the transatlantic slave trade reminds us that historical responsibility does not end with the formal elimination of unjust institutions, but continues for as many generations as are required to create genuine equality among people whose ancestors experience very different forms of justice and opportunity. The final image we should hold in our minds as we prepare to leave this history behind is that of the endless line of human beings who found themselves caught up in the transatlantic slave trade, the estimated 12 million people whose lives were transformed from freedom to bondage, from familiar worlds to alien environments, from individual identity to commodity status, from hope for the future to endurance of the present. Each of these people possessed a unique story, a specific combination of talents and limitations, a particular set of relationships that connected them to other human beings and to the natural world they inhabited. The systematic destruction of these individual lives represents one of the greatest crimes in human history, precisely because it treated unique beings as interchangeable parts in an economic machine whose sole purpose was the generation of wealth for people who would never know or care about the human beings whose labor made their prosperity possible. Yet we must also remember that these 12 million people were not simply victims of historical forces beyond their control, but also agents whose actions, choices, and sacrifices contributed to the moral transformation that eventually rejected slavery as incompatible with human dignity. Their survival strategies, their cultural adaptations, their resistance to dehumanization, their maintenance of family relationships and community solidarity under the most extreme circumstances imaginable, these responses to systematic oppression contained within them the moral insights that would eventually persuade their societies to reject the institutions that had exploited them. Their voices reaching us across the centuries through the narratives they created, the testimony they provided, the cultural expressions they developed, continue to speak to us about both the reality of historical injustice and the possibility of moral progress toward more equitable forms of social organization. The transatlantic slave trade thus stands as both a monument to human capacity for systematic cruelty and as testimony to human resilience in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances. It demonstrates how economic interests can corrupt moral understanding, how technological innovation can serve destructive purposes, how legal systems can legitimate systematic injustice, and how cultural traditions can be employed to justify the unjustifiable. But it also shows how moral understanding can evolve, how individual testimony can contribute to political transformation, how systematic oppression can generate resistance that eventually eliminates the conditions that make such oppression possible, and how historical memory can serve as a foundation for creating more just societies in the future. The challenge we face is to learn from this history without becoming either overwhelmed by its horror or complacent about the moral progress it documents, recognizing that the struggle for human dignity and social justice remains ongoing work that requires our active participation if the voices of those who suffered through the transatlantic slave trade are to find their proper fulfillment in the creation of a world where no human being need fear the system.